JOHAN, silence.
The Anatomy of Targaryen Dragons, House of the Dragon's Mighty Beasts Explored. It's weird to think now that when George R.R. Martin was conceptualizing A Song of Ice and Fire, he had to be convinced to add dragons to the story. Because as much as political intrigue, violent battles, and absolutely dismal weddings have become a part and parcel of his biggest creation to date, so have these fire-breathing creatures of myth and lore. But any fan of fantasy or Arthurian legends will tell you that George's dragons aren't even proper dragons. Whilst creating his beasts, Martin chose to stick to his realism in all things, and of course that applies to the more magical aspects of the known world as well. As a consequence, his dragons aren't only one of the most debated fantasy creations of all time, they are also the most mysterious, as their origins are not mentioned clearly across any sort of history book from Martin's world. So we thought we would give it a shot instead. This is the Anatomy of Targaryen Dragons Explored. And spoiler warning before you go any further, because there are going to be a lot of those in this video. This video is sponsored by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world. In this area of globalization, I have often felt the need to sharpen my skills in some foreign languages, especially before my trip to Germany. I was anxious that I wouldn't have enough time to enhance my command over the German language. This is when I was introduced to Babbel, and the 10-minute interactive lessons were extremely helpful. It helped me brush up on practical conversations, and also saved valuable time. The award-winning technology used by Babbel has been scientifically proven to help people learn new languages in just 3 weeks, and real language teachers make it a lot easier to understand. This app is also very simple to use on your phone and compatible with all kinds of devices. Their 20-day money-back guarantee makes it a lucrative deal, and do let us know which language you would like to learn and why. Check out the link in the description to get 65% off your subscription and start learning a new language today, because learning new languages can open up doors that you never knew existed. Tschüss und pass auf dich auf. Goodbye and take care. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. They went from being giant serpents to fire-breathing fables, dragons in real-world mythology. Before we explain how George R.R. Martin's dragons work, let's give you guys a short history of the creatures themselves, and how they are related to our lives. Dragons have technically been in existence in myth and fables for thousands of years. Hellenistic texts and even ancient Hindu texts make mentions of these massive creatures, but more often than not, they are presented to us as giant serpents or an avatar of said reptile. In ancient Greece, dragons were described as more snake-like than, well, dragon-like. Read any authentic story about Hercules' labors and pay close attention to the description of beings like Ladon and the Lernaean Hydra, and you will see what we are getting at. Even ancient Chinese and Japanese texts, known as the oldest sources for dragon lore, make reference to these beings in the context of serpents and snake-like beings. The Chinese dragon is famously depicted without any wings, and in Japanese cultures, dragons are related to the sea, not to fire, but most depictions of these creatures show them as having long, scaled bodies with a notable absence of wings, legs, or even flames. These three categories that have become synonymous with our understanding of a dragon are drawn from Arthurian legend, specifically the story of the White and the Red Dragon. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's fictional history of the Kings of England, one of the main sources for the legend of King Arthur, it is said that Merlin, the legendary sorcerer and advisor of King Arthur, found 2 dragons at the base of Dinas Emrys, where Vortigern was planning to build his mythic castle. The red dragon symbolized Wales, while the white symbolized the English. Their battle would go on to determine the fate of the British Isles, and this is the first recorded usage of dragons in a fantasy tale that ended up spawning the myth of dragons all across Europe. Earlier evidence of dragons being used in stories does exist, but Geoffrey of Monmouth's fictional tome is what popularized the creature's usage in medieval devices, banners, shields, and even armors. Over time, the perception of a dragon became somewhat set in stone. It was a 4-legged reptilian creature with scales and wings that breathed fire and was mostly found sleeping at the entrance to some obscure treasure or terrible secret. One of fantasy's most famous dragons, Smaug, fits this description perfectly, and perhaps that is also why he is so fondly remembered as fantasy's greatest draconic creation. But to George R.R. Martin, this design of a dragon was simply wrong. He wrote A Song of Ice and Fire to reflect things that happened in a real world by putting them in a fantasy setting, but no matter how far and wide he searched, he could not find a proper biological reason for why a winged reptile should have 4 legs separate from their wings. So he decided to cross his version of dragons with another mythological character to bring a semblance of realism to them, and those creatures were wyverns. Wyverns are like dragons, except they lack 2 key components that make them different. 1, they only have 2 legs as opposed to 4, and 2, they don't breathe fire. Like dragons, wyverns were a common sight on heraldry, coats of arms, royal banners, and other such symbols of royalty and power in the Middle Ages, and continue to be used till this day at places like the United States' Osan Air Base, where they serve as the mascot for the 51st Operations Support Squadron, whose motto is, "Breathe and Fire." As we noted in our introduction, George wasn't entirely sold on adding dragons to his story, because there was no way something like them could actually occur in nature. But once he was convinced to do so, he went ahead and conceptualized what we would consider to be the only realistic design that can support a fire-breathing lizard on all its limbs. So let's get into breaking down the anatomy of a Targaryen dragon now, shall we? The anatomy of a Targaryen dragon. In Fire and Blood, we are not simply given a history of the House of the Dragon, we are given a bit of background on the dragons themselves as well. Newborn dragons are called hatchlings. Older dragons that are not rider-worthy yet are called drakes, and only when they have reached a size and speed sufficient enough to fly and fight are these creatures called proper dragons. The origins of dragons are highly disputed by the many scholars who would populate the known world. The only people who are known to have tamed and ridden them are the Valyrians, and the story they tell us is one that leaves us with more questions than answers. It is said that the Valyrians actually started their lives as peaceful sheep herders on the Valyrian Peninsula. They only became greedy tyrants once they discovered dragons lairing in the 14 Flames of Valyria, which was a chain of active volcanoes that dotted the peninsula. The Valyrians are said to have tamed these beasts with strength as much as sorcery, and over the course of recorded history, no other race of mankind has been able to tame and ride a dragon like the Dragon Lords did. Breeding and using dragons was probably the best thing that could have happened to the Valyrians from a strategic standpoint, because it took them from being shepherds to the literal masters of half of Essos. A lot of this has to do with dragons' physiology. Let's break this down into 4 stages so it's easier for you guys to understand. Dragons are born from scaled eggs that are just as beautiful as they are precious. It is said that 1 dragon egg can buy a man a ship and 3 can buy him ships and an army, so the value of a dragon egg cannot be overstated. But these dragons are only found where the dragons make their lairs, and that only happens in places of warmth and heat. During their hatchling stage, dragons cannot do much and grow to the size of a common house cat. They are literal infants, and need to be taken care of and fed much like an infant. Daenerys struggles with raising her children initially because she has no idea how to raise a dragon. She doesn't even know that dragons only eat cooked meat. A hatchling's lifespan can be rather short if they are not looked after, and given enough space and food to grow with, which is why you don't see a lot of dragons flying around these days, except the ones Dany has. And more than that, certain conditions must be met for a dragon egg to even hatch. It is said that the heat is a critical factor in the birth of a dragon, as many of the Targaryen dragon eggs that were brought to King's Landing after the conquest did not hatch, whereas dragon eggs would keep Dragonstone's hatcheries positively occupied. After the Dance of the Dragons, most dragon eggs turned into stone, and every future Targaryen king failed to hatch a single one of them, even after bringing in mages to try to magic them into cracking open. But if a hatchling manages to survive its infancy, then it moves on to the next stage, where it is a young drake. A drake is a growing dragon whose scales are still a bit too soft, whose flames are still a bit too low, and who still cannot properly fly. The shape of a dragon's body in George R.R. Martin's creation makes it impossible for them to take flight unless their bodies are in perfect balance. George's dragons have 4 limbs, 2 hind legs, and 2 forearms that also double as their wings, making them more akin to bats and pterosaurs. His dragons are also horned and have long necks and tails, which is why it is so important for balance to be achieved before that first flight. A known example of a dragon still being in its drake stage is sea smoke in 101 AC, as according to Fire and Blood, the pale silver-gray dragon had already been bonded to Laenor Velaryon, but had never been ridden, implying sea smoke wasn't big enough to be ridden by that point. But after a few years had passed, and he had gotten more food to eat and space to fly, Sea Smoke grew into a majestic adult dragon, who was of battle size within 30 years of existence. Once a dragon reaches a size where it is large enough to take a rider to and from a faraway location without any noticeable trouble, they are considered to be fully grown. These are the beings that most denizens of the known world flee at first sight from. Dragons have scales that are harder than steel, and shooting arrows at their body is practically useless, unless you are aiming for the exposed flesh specifically. Their wing membranes are sturdy, almost leathern, but not invincible, as they can be poked through with enough fire arrows and even normal arrows being fired at them. So technically, the wings are the weak point of a dragon, as are their eyes, because it is the only other unprotected part of their entire body. Piercing a dragon's flesh is hard work, but it pays off in spades. Just read the history of Meraxes, or go rewatch Game of Thrones and watch Euron's scorpion bolts go to town on Rhaegal. You might think that a dragon's mouth would also make it vulnerable, but as Septon Barth once wrote, death comes out of a dragon's gullet. It does not go in that way. Killing a dragon by making it swallow swords or a charging spearman seems a bit of a goofy way to kill it, considering the swords and the spearmen will probably melt in its belly, and that is something we will get to in a second. Most living creatures have a limit when it comes to just how big they can grow, but apparently not dragons. Sir Barristan Selmy once told Dany that if a dragon was given nourishment and space to grow, they could just end up growing in size endlessly. At his death, Balerion the Black Dread was so huge that he could barely get himself off the ground, let alone fly over long distances. Drogon himself had only been for this world for a couple of years, but already he had grown big enough for Dany to ride, his wingspan reaching 20 feet when fully unfurled. So there is some truth to the saying that a dragon keeps growing until it runs out of space, which is why every dragon pit-bred dragon is so small comparatively, but it isn't entirely contingent on the dragon's age. For instance, Meraxes was said to be larger than Vhagar, but younger to her in terms of her age. So the size and speed of a dragon isn't a matter of age, it's a matter of holistic growth and development. As for their nature, well, dragons are often called fire-made flesh in A Song of Ice and Fire, and that appears to be as literal of a statement as it is poetic. The thing that fundamentally makes dragons such an important resource is the fact that they breathe fire. A dragon's flames only grow stronger as they grow older. A hatchling can barely light up a bunch of straw, whereas a full-grown dragon can melt steel and even stone with its dragon flame. It is said that in colder climates, a dragon's body can be seen steaming because of its intrinsic heat, and that the older a dragon goes, the hotter its flames become, increasing a dragon's lethality with every passing year. Dragon scales, too, follow a similar trend, as they get harder, larger, and more difficult to break through with the growth of a dragon. Flames, knives, arrows, and such are not like to make any effect on the dragon grown enough, although the one thing that dragons remain perpetually vulnerable to is dragon flame itself. This is why a fight between two dragons is said to be the most beautiful and grisly thing in the world, because they can only be properly killed by their own kind. In fact, the fire is within their blood itself, quite literally. When Drogon is attacked in the fighting pits of Meereen, George tells us that his wounds were smoky and dripping with hot blood. In Fire and Blood, when Arya Targaryen returns to King's Landing on Balerion's back, the Black Dread is seen with a 9-foot-long smoking rent in his side from their year-long absence. This indicates that a dragon's blood is literally on fire, and that it is so hot that when it's exposed to the atmosphere, it begins smoking. As for a dragon's mating habits, they are largely unknown. Scholars are completely divided on how a dragon reproduces, with traditional scholars like Yandel and Gildane arguing that dragons had defined sexes, whilst other more mystical scholars like Maester Aemon and Septon Barth argue that a dragon's sex is interchangeable, like their flames, now one thing and now another. This makes it extremely difficult to pin down a dragon's gender. So dragons are gendered based off whether they have laid clutches of eggs or not, which is probably the most uncertain method of sex determination we've ever heard of. What is certain is the fact that their bones could literally be steel. A dragon's skeletal structure is highly durable, to the point that you could make a better sword than you'd find on the street of steel with a single tooth of a dragon. Dragon bone is one of the most versatile and rare elements for weapon making in the known world. A dragon's skeleton, unlike that of many other creatures, is black in color, to the point that it shines like onyx if a light hits it just right. This is because of the extremely high iron content found within them, which gives them their characteristic shade and durability. A dragon's teeth are said to be razor sharp and can make better daggers than any ordinary kind of steel. Dragon bone is famed for its lightness and its strength, making it one of the best materials to create strong, accurate bows with. So as the old adage goes, literally everything about a dragon and its anatomy is useful in the context of warfare and trade, because they are the fantasy equivalent of WMDs after all. But somehow House of the Dragon has managed to expand upon this anatomical knowledge of a dragon and give us what we wanted, which is more information. How House of the Dragon built upon the anatomy of Targaryen dragons. Dragons throughout the history of their existence have mainly been used as weapons of war. They were the main reason behind the rise of the Valyrian freehold, which had a chokehold on the known world for nearly 5,000 years, and according to House of the Dragon, they weren't simply born to do this. They were bred for this specific purpose. Showrunners Ryan Condal and Miguel Sapochnik revealed that when they were designing their dragons, they worked on 3 distinct types of dragons. The first was what they called dinosaur-type dragons. These dragons had skulls that resembled that of a dinosaur, and were known for being total powerhouses in the field of war. Balerion the Black Dread and Dany's Drogon are 2 dragons who neatly fit this category. The second type is what they call a wolf-type dragon, whose skull is shaped more like a wolf's than a dinosaur's, presumably because they were bred specifically to hunt down the Dragon Lord's enemies. Caraxes the Bloodworm is a perfect example of this type of dragon, and the third is a horse-type dragon whose purpose is to serve more as a mount than a mass-destructive weapon. Their skulls are distinguished by the elongated feel they have to them, and they can also be called the palfreys of dragonkind. Rhaenyra Targaryen's dragon Syrax falls under this category. While we are calling these 3 types of dragons breeds, we must also note that George R.R. Martin has never really called his dragons similar. To him, all his dragons are unique. Their color does not matter, and neither does their skeletal structure. What does matter is their projected growth rate, and this is where House of the Dragon makes a second addition to the anatomy of a dragon that we find very interesting and logical at the same time. According to Ryan and Miguel, a dragon's body, once it starts aging beyond its prime, begins to suffer from the consequences of the square cube law. The square cube law basically states that an object's volume increases far more rapidly than its size. This is the reason why something like a growth ray would not work, because if your body was increased to a size that is unnatural, it would collapse in on itself due to the dissonance between its surface area and volume. The same thing happens to dragons. According to Ryan and Miguel, dragons are creatures of war, and are not expected to live beyond a certain time frame due to the sheer amount of action that they used to see at the height of the freehold. But once a dragon is allowed to live beyond that point, its ever-growing nature is what becomes its bane. Using this logic, the showrunners explained that the reason why Balerion could not be roused in his final years was because he would literally shatter his legs upon landing if he tried to fly around too much. Ryan and Miguel have also described Vhagar, who is going to be the largest dragon we see in House of the Dragon, as a B-52 bomber. She is slow to take off and more than rusty on the landing, but once she is in the air, she is a juggernaut you do not want to face from 1,000 leagues away. In order to make their dragons riding worthy, the Dragon Lords would poke holes in their wing membranes from a young age, so they could slip reins inside of them and strap saddles to their fire-breathing mounts. The Dragon Lords also trained their dragons to respond to commands in High Valyrian, which we saw in Episode 1, when Syrax was made to return to her lair in the Dragon Pit. Dragons also seem to share a psychic bond with their riders, and will only allow one person to become their rider in the latter's lifetime. Once a dragon has bonded with someone, they will only bend their necks for that person, and anyone they allow onto their backs. A person that has not bonded with a dragon will face an untimely death if they attempt to ride said dragon, as you will see in later seasons of House of the Dragon. But how exactly did dragons become Westeros' nukes? Well, for that, we must refer to the accounts of a Septon, ironically enough. Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns, Their Unnatural History by Barth. Many maesters in the current timeline seem to be content with the explanation that the Valyrians found their dragons in the 14 Flames, but there was one man who was more skeptical than his scholarly counterparts. After witnessing the horrors that unfolded in the last hours of Princess Arya Targaryen's life, Barth began working on his book called An Unnatural History, which documents the said unnatural history of a dragon. A Song of Ice and Fire names at least 7 books on dragon lore, and most of them have already been destroyed, but we put stock in Barth's work for the simple reason that most of what we seem to have deduced about the known world was correct. So keeping that in mind, it is possible that dragons were not born, but were instead created using blood magic. Barth's book names 3 creatures who seem totally unrelated at first, but become increasingly correlated as you think harder about them in relation to one another. Maesters are aware of the existence of wyverns, have been for years, and people who have visited Sothorios have even seen these feral beasts in flight. Wyverns are basically dragons who lack the fire-breathing aspect of what makes them so cool, but there is another species of creatures who could have possibly given them said aspect if they were crossed with one another. The 14 Flames are also said to be home of massive fire worms, worms that breathe flames and can bore through rocks and solid stone. These worms have only been recorded in the histories of Valyria, as no record of a fireworm has ever come out of Dragonstone where the Dragonmont resides, so it is possible that they were native to that peninsula only. A fragment of Barth's Unnatural History states that dragons must have been created from wyvern stock, so if you put everything we've said so far together, then you've come to the basic conclusion that the Valyrian blood mages must have found a way to cross wyverns with fireworms. But there is another aspect of the dragon that is peculiar, and that is the so-called dragon bond. Don't you think it is weird that only one race of mankind was able to tame dragons and ride them like stallions? Well, what if we told you they were created that way? Across the world of Ice and Fire, you will find mention of the Valyrians crossing multiple breeds of predatory animals with their slaves in the flesh pits of Grogosos, a city infamous for its practice of the dark arts. Given the fact that they were able to literally shape molten stone like it was clay, we would say that Valyrian blood magic had more practical applications than creating decorative sconces, and it appears that that was the case when it came to the dragons. Dragons are often called magical creatures, and their existence itself is highly tethered to the magics of the known world. When the dragons died the first time around, magic began fading from the world. But when Dany hatched her dragons, it became stronger than it had been in centuries, so it only makes sense that some magic was involved in the creation of dragons as well, and this is where things get super weird. Have you guys seen that Rick and Morty episode where Rick, Morty, and Summer create a soul bond with a dragon? Well, we think that that exact scene isn't quite far off from what must have been the process of the Valyrians used to create the dragons. We think that the blood mages of Valyria crossed wyverns, fireworms, and their known blood together in a trifecta of sorcery that gave birth to the greatest weapons known to the world. That would explain the dragons' worm-like appearance, wyvern-esque body type, and why they are so tied to the blood of the dragon. Barth also speculated that the Valyrians did not learn how to rear dragons themselves. They were taught this art from an elder race that came from Ashai by the Shadow, and even Dany thinks to herself that dragons were first found in the Shadow, so it is possible that the Valyrians did not actually come up with this method of dragon taming themselves. They were taught it by a long-forgotten race of beings. But that is a topic for an entirely different video. Suffice it to say, dragons might not be the natural marvel that the world considers them to be, but we're going to have to wait to see if House of the Dragon will shed any light on this particular topic or not. For now, we are happy to sit back and watch the many dragons that we've been promised we will get come to life on screen. Marvelous verdict. The anatomy of a dragon is a fickle thing to try to pin down, especially when it comes to fictional dragons, but George R.R. Martin has given us just enough information to know what makes them so powerful, but to remain aloof of the reason behind their strengths. A dragon is the most powerful and terrifying thing in the world, the maesters say, and based off of everything we have told you about them, it is not an entirely inaccurate statement now, is it? But no matter how much we try to find out, dissect, debate, and resolve the mystery behind their origins, we cannot help but be fascinated by their anatomy. They are equally frail and unstoppable, and one breath could end up being a death sentence for you and your loved ones. A dragon is as vulnerable as it is violent, and it is that dichotomy that makes them and their enemies so intriguing to us. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.